This video is part of the Purchasing Instructional Guide for setting up the project settings. We're going to talk about a few areas of the project. On the left side menu, we're going to take a look at the project profile, the actual tabs across the top. We're going to take a look at tasks and expense types and the items, the new items feature. We're going to talk a little bit about the project administrators, specifically the new project approver setting that's on here, and some of the other roles as our new project administrator in the system. I do want to leave you at the end with a few things to keep in mind as project managers and the project management team. There's a few areas I want to make sure that you're aware of so that as you're setting up your projects, you're aware of some additional training that might be needed to make sure that you can maximize the efficiencies and the functionality that's within the 11.0 release. So I'm going to move over to the system here. And I'm going to be logged in here on this home dashboard. I'm actually logged in as a system administrator user. We know that to manage projects and project settings, we need to be logged in as a user that has the project manager role. However, I'm going to log in as the administrator so I can show you some other areas of the system as well. It would be the project manager that would have access to do the updates and settings that I'm going to share with you today. So I've just gone to a typical search and list page for our projects, and I'm going to work with this one project down here at the bottom. I'm going to show you the new features here. If we look at the time tab, on our time tab, we have a typical, the allow time reporting. We've seen that before. That's always been with our system. I want you to keep that in mind because we're going to look at that again here in a minute. This new field here, this new flag here called require purchase order for non-employee PO time. Okay, the same flag is over here on the expenses to require PO for non-employee expense. If you are going to be associating time or expense using a subcontractor to this project through your purchase request and your purchase order, and then of course our vendor invoice to show up on the customer invoice, and you check this flag, what you're telling the system to do is any time or expense is associated with this project, that it needs to make sure that it has a matching purchase order line. So in this example, the time, we would need to make sure, actually I can show that to you here. Okay, so if we are telling this project here that we want to make sure that to require a purchase order for a non-employee time, what we're telling the system to do is that make sure that there is a labor detail line associated with engineer in order before you allow a timesheet or a vendor invoice to be associated with this. So regardless of how you put time in, whether you put it in as a subcontractor entering time, or if you put time in as a vendor invoice, just associating that time from your vendor into your vendor invoice, it has to have a purchase order, and that purchase order has to have a labor line or an expense line based on the way that you put your settings over here. Okay, very, very powerful feature. It's extremely helpful and useful to making sure that the number of errors are minimized and to ensure that the proper costs are associated with your project. So this is a very nice feature that allows us as project managers to ensure that the right type of cost charges go against our project, whether they're on the time or the expense. And the one thing I want to keep in mind to share with folks is that it does not matter if your subcontractor that you're associating your labor with is a vendor invoice person or if they are actually doing timesheets in the system. This setting would require for both. Okay, so that's a new setting there. I saw that on the expense side. And then we have a new tab called the items, and what this allows item reporting on this project or not. So when we're doing our purchase order over here, if we were trying to do a particular, this is the items area, if we were wanting to associate an item with a project, this project code, the system's going to come back and say, well, you're asking for this particular project. It's going to go over to the project and ensure that the items tab has this allow reporting. Otherwise, you would not be able to associate a items charge with this project. So that's how we allow item reporting and item charging against a particular project. Now let's talk a little bit about tasks. We are going to come back to items in just a minute, but we're going to talk a little bit about tasks. There's some new settings on the task. And if we were to take a look at the task and added a new one, we have the time tab, and we now can allow time reporting at the task level. So this is a brand new feature that's going to give you a lot of flexibility to whether or not a particular task should have time or expense associated with it. And this one here is that same line that you saw at the project level, that you could identify that if somebody's going to charge this project and this task, and you're going to say that they have to have the project setting right now says they have to have a PO, but you're saying for this one they don't have to, you can identify that all the way down to the task level. On the expense side, same features are available here as it relates to expense. And the items tab as well, we have the same feature allowing us to decide that this task does not allow items. The project does, but this task does not. All right, speaking of items, we know that in our system, we have the ability at a project to create project level expenses, expense types, project level labor categories, project level locations, and project level codes, pay codes. We have that same option here with items. So from our master list of all the items within the database, we can subset the master list and identify that only these items on the left, on the right-hand side here, are available to be used when we do our purchase order or our purchase request. So if we were to add a new one, the only ones that would show up in this table here would be the ones that were identified for this project, only because we identified a project. You would go back to the project and look to see if that item is on the list, and if so, then that would allow you to associate that with a purchase request, purchase order, or a vendor invoice. So that's on the items. I will come back to expense types and items. There is a relationship here I want to share with you. On the administrators, this is a new area of the system where we have project approvers that we allow other areas of approval. So we used to have timesheets and expense. We now have broken down the timesheet into timesheets and leave. And then we also have the option for the expense report, expense request, purchase orders, and purchase request, and the vendor invoices. If we want to require this flag here at the top for project approvers before a manager, so this is a similar feature as we have on the customer side. This feature here with the customer has been here for a while. We've moved that over, or copied that over, to this project approver side. So now the project approver, whoever's listed in this list over here, if we check this flag, what this says is that in this example, if we're going to be putting a vendor invoice through and we submit a vendor invoice for processing, the system's going to go to the project first, and it's going to say, is this flag checked? And if it is, then Fran is going to get this request for approval before the managers that are listed in the approval group. So this is a way to control, to ensure that the managers and the project approvers don't get it at the same time, that we have the project approver take a look at it first and do that approval first before it moves on through the rest of the approval process. All right, and we notice here down at the bottom we have a few new project administrator roles, the document viewer and the project PO viewer, project PR viewer. These are new roles that are within the system, and then there is a training available to talk about what all the different roles do in the system. There's another video and some training documentation about the new roles on the person setup is the video that you might want to take a look at. But then as well, you can also identify those actually over on the project side as well. So the one area I want to share with you before we leave is back on your profile tab. I want to share with you the accounting tab. So on the, I'm sorry, not the accounting tab, your budget tab. On the budget tab, notice that we have our labor budget and our expense budget. If you notice, we don't have an items budget. So it's very important to be aware that if you're going to be budgeting your items that are going to be used on your project, they have to be budgeted in the expense area. So in our expense plans and our expense budgets, if we want to identify our items and break those out separately, we need to make sure to put that budget here into the expense side. And if you need to see that broken down separately over on your cost reports, if you want to look at that separately, you're going to need to put them into separate projects, right? Because we only have one budget field for our bill and our cost for our expenses. So we can certainly budget our items, but they would be budgeted in the expense area. With that, in order to budget in the expense area, you would need to make sure, so if we go to our expense budgets, if we were to add a new budget, notice that the items that we can budget for, if we go into add a new one, if we're going to add a new one, we can add the ones that are in the system for this project, right? So if we go to our expense types, I'm just going to open up a new tab so we can see that. And our expense type, these are the types of expenses that we've identified. And had I not added these items here, these expense types called item, then we would not have been able to budget them over here. Right. So just a thing to keep in mind, one of those considerations for you to keep in mind, we can absolutely budget your items. You'll budget them in the expense section, and if you need to see them broken out separately, like different budgets for them, you would need to have separate projects. But because you use the new expense types, we recommend that you create new expense types. You can actually see them broken down over in the cost summary report. You can see them broken down by expense type, and then you can also, on your vendor invoice, we can break those apart, and on your customer invoice as well. So we can break them apart in other areas, but for budgeting purposes, I want to make sure that you're aware of that. Another thing on the process, just to be aware of, the project, the people assignments. If we're going to be using, this is only true if you're using subcontractors that are going to be entering time directly into the system. If you're using subcontractors on your vendor invoice only, right, they're going to send you an invoice, you're going to apply that vendor invoice to the system, and you're just going to associate those using that new VI person feature, then this part doesn't apply. But if you're managing your project with subcontractors that are going to be entering time directly into the system, you want to make sure to get that additional training on the purchase order assignments. So under purchase order assignments, this is an area that's over in our financials. Under purchasing, under purchase order assignments, the purchase order assignments need to be put in place before your project assignments. Right? And the reason is that your project assignments authorizes subcontractors to do work, right? It authorizes our people to do work, and you want to make sure that before you create that work authorization, that commitment for subcontractors to do work, that you make sure that the purchase order assignments are in place. There's additional training on how to do purchase order assignments in the Knowledge Center and the help docs, but from a process standpoint, I want to make sure that you're aware of it in your project settings, that if you're going to be working subcontractors that enter time directly, that your people assignments, make sure that you have that relationship with your PO assignments. Okay. So that concludes the training that I wanted to share with you today on how to set up your projects within the new 11.0 release.